does it within a word and the other does it across words. So it's no accident that a language with a very robust morphology would have a relatively sparse syntax, like Kavunjo, and a language with a very robust syntax would have a relatively sparse morphology, like English. There are trade-offs within the system. The smallest part of language is the phonological or phonetic component. Spoken words and morphemes are all made up of phonemes, which are the most basic, meaningful sound units in a language. Or in a sign language, they would be the smallest manual units. English has a total of 44 phonemes. And in our example sentence, there are 14 of them, which can also be written in a phonetic alphabet. I'm getting really hot. 14 phonemes there. Within a language, there are rules about which phonemes can and cannot follow one another. So while Polish allows many consonants to cluster without a vowel, English permits far fewer, with 3 at the most at the front of a word, as in splash, and 4 maximum at the end of the word, as in twelfths. These rules are non-negotiable. If you are a spy and combine phonemes in a way that doesn't follow the rules of a language, well, you just blew your cover. As with morphemes, there's a large range of phonemes used in different languages. On the low end, the Amazonian language Paraha is thought to have only 11 phonemes, and on the other, there are African click languages that have up to 141 phonemes. The range of phonemes reveals one of the challenges in learning a foreign language. Different languages often use very different sounds. It's obvious how this would make it hard for native English speakers to learn an African click language because English doesn't use clicking phonemes. But sometimes it's more challenging when phonemes in a foreign language are only slightly different from your own. For example, it's well known that Japanese speakers have great difficulty making the RL distinction, and they often confuse words like rice and lice. But it's not because the RL sounds are totally foreign to Japanese speakers. In fact, Japanese uses an intermediate phoneme called a flap that is the phonetic middle ground between R and L. It sounds like ra, as in ramen. That's the delicious Japanese soup. Note the difference. Ra, la, ra, la. In this case, when native Japanese speakers hear the English RL sounds, they think they're hearing their own native phoneme. Their brain is playing tricks on them. And just so you know, it goes both ways too. There are many mistakes that English speakers make when trying to understand Japanese. For example, I always mix up 2 Japanese words that have opposite meanings. Ite in Japanese means stay, but ite means go. Such words are called minimal pairs. They're identical except for one phoneme. In this case, the phoneme is called a geminate, which is just a brief pause before a consonant sound. The second item in the pair has the geminate, so after the E sound, you would put a pause a fraction of a second before you'd say the te sound. Here it is exaggerated. Ite, ite. In a later lecture, I'll talk more about these challenges at the phonetic level. So now we need to pull back for a broader view to talk about the final component of language, pragmatics. Pragmatics is all about how people use language, and it reveals language as a powerful tool for accomplishing social goals. In the study of pragmatics, these goals are often referred to as intentions, and as you'll soon see, understanding intentions can be tricky business. Let's return to our example. I'm getting really hot. If you think about it, there are many potential meanings of this utterance. One meaning is a literal statement about my rising temperature, sort of like an uninspired status update on Facebook. But it could also have different meanings. It could be a metaphoric statement that I'm getting really angry, as in, my blood is starting to boil. Or it could be a sarcastic remark. Imagine saying it like this. I'm getting really hot. Saying it like that actually has the opposite meaning. Or maybe it's not even a statement at all, but an indirect request for something. Suppose I'm in the backseat of a car and I said, I'm getting really hot, to politely request that the driver turn down the heat. Or maybe I'm requesting a drink of water or asking someone to open a window. Who knows? And that's the point. There's often nothing inherent in the literal meaning of the words that reveals a speaker's intentions. To solve this problem, a listener needs to make a pragmatic inference, an inference about the intentions of the speaker. If you pay close attention, you might be surprised at how often the literal content of what people say is quite different from their true intentions. One more thing. We've talked about how the other components of language have interesting differences across languages. Pragmatics is no exception. Because pragmatics involves social goals, it interfaces with things like culture in ways that other parts of language do not. In fact, pragmatics is the one component of language that will probably get you in the most trouble when communicating with people from other cultures. Many Americans love their sarcasm, but it comes across as confusing or worse, rude in some other cultures. Indirect requests are also highly variable across countries. When I speak to my Dutch and German friends, they often find indirect requests to be too disguised. But when I speak to my Japanese friends, they find my direct requests to be too blunt. As I said earlier, pragmatics is tricky business. Now that I've laid out these 5 components of language, I hope you're starting to appreciate the comparison to the digestive system. Just like digestion, it's not possible to point to one linguistic component and say, there it is, there's language. Just like digestion, the interaction of these different components is what defines language as a system. But do you recall that I told you that language and digestion differ in one important way? In digestion, the sequence of the components is linear and operates in stages. You've got to swallow your food before your stomach can break it down, and this must happen before your intestines can absorb the nutrients. You might be tempted to think that the 5 components of language operate in the same way. For example, when I say these words right now, you might expect that processing of my utterance goes through a predictable sequence of small to large. For example, starting with an analysis of phonemes, moving up to chunking them into morphemes and then words, which is followed by understanding the syntax and finished by grasping my intention. Makes sense, right? But language is nonlinear and multidirectional. In addition to piecing the smallest units together into the larger ones, language works the other direction too. The largest units work backwards to simultaneously guide the processing of the smaller ones. This multidirectionality is not how digestion works. After all, what happens in your intestines does not affect how you swallow your food. Or an upset stomach does not cause pain in your jaw. In digestion, what happens down the line does not have any direct and profound bearing on what happens early on. Language is different. Language goes multiple ways at once, not just some of the time, but all of the time. Let's take a look at 3 examples of how larger components of language feed back to influence smaller components of the system. Let's start with pragmatics. Pragmatic goals and intentions are often the starting point, not just the ending point, for all other parts of language. Returning to our examples of "I'm getting really hot," note that the meaning of the utterance is largely dependent on the context. If the context is that someone is really angry, the utterance may be seen as a metaphor for emotion. If the context is that you're actually in a chilly environment, it may be interpreted as sarcasm. And if the context is that you know the speaker is thirsty, it may be viewed as an indirect request. You might think, well, fine. First, people process the literal meaning of the whole sentence, and then they consider the context only later on to reinterpret the message. However, scientific studies show that this is often not the case. How many times have you heard requests like, "Can you pass the salt? Can you close the door? Can you be quiet?" These are called conventional indirect requests, and they all mean something other than their literal content. Of course you're capable of passing the salt. That's not the question. Actually, it's not a question at all. It's a polite request. What's interesting is that neuroscience techniques measuring electrical signals in the brain showed that the time course of understanding these requests happens so fast that people aren't even interpreting them as questions at all. In other words, it seems that the brain bypasses the literal meaning and goes directly to the intention. By the way, we'll talk much more about these neuroimaging techniques in later lectures. This is a classic example of a higher component or level of language, pragmatics, feeding downward onto a lower one, semantics. The second example is a case where the syntax of a sentence sets you up to expect a certain meaning. Consider this utterance. Time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. Strange, huh? The syntactic trick here is that flies in the first part of the sentence is a verb, but in the second part, it's a noun. Time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. They like to eat bananas. These are called garden path sentences, and they're called that because they lead you down one syntactic path only to trick you with a different one later. There are all sorts of examples of these garden path sentences, and many of them are accidental. Some of the funniest ones are actual headlines from real newspapers. One of my favorites is this headline, which is also the title of a book on the subject by Gloria Cooper. Squad helps dog bite victim. Why on earth would a canine crew help a dog to bite a victim? The key lies in realizing that dog bite is actually an adjective modifying victim, and not the noun dog doing the biting. Squad helps dog bite victim. In other words, the victim of a dog bite. These are just a few examples of how readers and listeners build up expectations from syntax to help anticipate the meaning of words before we even read or hear them. To illustrate the third example, let me play for you a sentence that was used in a classic study by the experimental psychologist Richard Warren in 1970. I'll play it for you 3 times, and I ask that you pay close attention to how many times you hear the first S in the word legislatures. There are 2 S's, so listen for the first one. Just to help you, there'll be a coughing sound just to let you know when you should pay attention.